Hello everyone, thank you for joining me. This is the fourth lecture of my short course on livelihood research. In lecture 2 and 3, I discuss the basics of livelihood research and its context, and in this lecture I will focus on the Sustainable Livelihood Framework. My name is Leo de Haan and I'm from the Netherlands. Give me a second to share my screen. I am Emeritus Professor of Development Studies. For my retirement, I was Rector of the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. The ISS is the oldest and leading development studies institute in the world. Before my appointment at ISS, I directed the African Studies Center in Leiden, the largest center of its kind in Europe. I was trained as a human geographer, and throughout my academic career, I have focused my research on livelihoods in Africa. This course is on the MA level, and it is open to all interested students, anywhere in the world. The purpose of this lecture series is to make you familiar with livelihood research and to inspire you to use it. In lecture 2 and 3, I explained the basics of livelihood research and offered some initial reflections on issues like capitals, material and immaterial needs, and access to assets and opportunities. In this fourth lecture, I'll introduce you to an advanced interpretation and practice of livelihood research. This lecture series also has a second objective, call it a reflective objective. That reflective objective is about contextualizing livelihood research against the backdrop of a critical assessment of development studies itself. An advanced interpretation and practice of livelihood research can only be achieved through this second objective. So let's start with the Sustainable Livelihood Framework. It was once an influential interpretation of livelihood research. Sometimes it was called the DIFID framework. In the third lecture, I explained that in the late 1990s, livelihood research was given a boost by DIFID, the Department for International Development, the British State Development Agency, as part of an attempt of the Blair administration to profile itself. The proactive, self-help image of the poor in livelihood thinking fitted very well with the image the Blair administration wanted to demonstrate. DFID initiated a large number of research projects in order to design the Sustainable Livelihood Framework, which then became the blueprint for its poverty alleviation projects. Because it dominated livelihood research for more than a decade, I propose to have a closer look at the framework. At the center of the framework is the famous Pentagon of Capitals, on which people build their livelihoods: human, natural, physical, financial, and social capital. The Pentagon became the identifying icon of DFID's finance research and development interventions. If you couldn't present a Pentagon in those days, you were not taken seriously. On the right-hand side, you find the livelihood strategies. These are the strategies to achieve the desired livelihood outcomes, such as more income and increased well-being. Left-hand side is the vulnerability context. In my second lecture, I talked about shocks and stresses. Here they are named shocks, trends, and seasonality, and put together in one box. Different terms that point at the same reality, which I explained in my second lecture. That is, livelihoods are vulnerable because capitals are embedded in structure, which have its impact upon the capitals. I explained in lecture 3 why I prefer the concepts capabilities, assets, and resources over capital. But for the sake of clarity, I will use the term capitals when explaining the Sustainable Livelihood Framework. In the middle, you find an intriguing box called Transforming Structures and Processes. Though the terms are, in my view, a bit misleading and inaccurate, it is an interesting box because it defines more in detail the structure I identified in my second lecture. These transforming structures and processes determine the access to capitals people use to implement their livelihood strategies. In this box, structures are, for example, local and regional governments, creating more capital by constructing roads and irrigation works. Processes are culture or laws that may either promote or limit access to capitals. For example, a cultural feature as gender norms may hinder women's access to capital. And a law protecting private property may safeguard someone's access to land and prohibit someone else's access. In my opinion, see again the second lecture, the terminology of this box could have been more accurate. Structure should be named organizations. Now, structure would be much more appropriate for the term processes. In my view, also the vulnerability context is part of what I call structure in my second lecture. The Sustainable Livelihood Framework became a well-known organized way to gain an insight into people's livelihoods and to design development interventions that would enhance their livelihoods. And admittedly, it is conveniently organized and arranged, not too complicated, easy to copy, or better, to adapt to different circumstances, as long as you take my commands into account. Moreover, with that box, structures and processes, or in my terminology, organizations and structure, in the center, it immediately points at where the bottlenecks for livelihood strategies are situated, for example, in governments, in institutions like property relations, or in culture like gender norms. At the same time, this is also the arena where the interventions should take place to eliminate these bottlenecks. Critics have correctly argued that the framework focuses too much on the micro level and neglects the higher levels of skill. Indeed, if you focus on people's livelihood strategies, you focus on what they do, and you see that happening, as it were, right under your nose. Hence, processes far away from the lives you are witnessing disappear below the horizon. They are neglected, although they may have enormous impacts on livelihoods. For example, markets tend to be perceived as physical places of trade or as produce prices offered by local traders. But prices are also influenced further up by monopolies, by government policies or subsidies, and by world markets. These all tend to be neglected. Of course, these issues are captured in the box transforming processes and structures and vulnerability context. But in practice, many researchers forgot that. If you only focus on the access to assets, you tend to forget the influence of the wider environment. For its clarity, relative simpleness, and adaptability to various circumstances, the framework is also an elegant starting point for student research, with lots of opportunities to include your own interest and scientific creativity. For example, with the shape of the pentagon, you can depict a household's access to various assets. In the top left picture, the blue household has only limited access to virtually all assets as compared to the red household. The bottom right picture typically depicts a poor urban household with limited access to natural and financial capital and their own labor, that is human capital, as the main resource. In this example, taken from a livelihood survey of a San community resettlement project in the Kavango West in Namibia, a survey done by an MA student, the relevant policy is the land reform and resettlement policy of the Namibian government, and the transforming structures, that is, organizations with impact on the case, are identified as the MLR, the Ministry of Lands and Resettlement, KNDA, the Comio Namibia Development Agency, and SRPBRC, which is the resettlement project itself. I hope that these comments and short examples will encourage you to start thinking about how you would do livelihood research. But please be aware that thus far I have only discussed the state of affairs in livelihood research between 2000 and 2010. Since then, livelihood results evolve further, and that is what I'm going to show you in the next lectures. I hope that you will also take into account the second part of this lecture when doing livelihood research. The second part is about contextualization. A fundamental critique of livelihood research in the period 2000-2010 is the neglect of power relations. To fully understand that critique, we need to turn to the second objective of our lecture series, the reflective objective about contextualizing. With respect to the neglect of power relations, I must first discuss the actor-structure debate and then the impact of the neoliberal ideology. Among social scientists, there is a continuous debate on whether social structure is the decisive factor in social phenomena or human behavior. So-called structuralists say it's structure or socialization. That is the way people learn and accept the values and norms of their society. While their opponents say it's the agency of actors. In the 1980s, Anthony Giddens, a British sociologist, argued in his structuration theory that it is not either or, but and. According to Giddens, structure and agency are integrated. Actors, he prefers to call them agents, conform to social conventions, but by doing that, agents can also modify social conventions, and that he calls agency. So in organizing their livelihoods, people respect social conventions when they look for outlets for their ambitions and solutions to their problems. But in doing so, they can also change social conventions. On the one hand, their agency enables them to reshape social conditions. On the other hand, structural bottlenecks and barriers prevent that. According to Giddens, agency nor structure are on top. Also Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, argued that it is structure nor actor, but both. However, he arrived at a different assessment, and he also used different concepts. According to Bourdieu, people organize their livelihoods in various overlapping social fields. Social fields can be almost anything: a market, an academic discipline, a household, a neighborhood, education, employment, etc. In all those fields, actors compete in a power play for resources and opportunities. And each social field has its own implicit rules of the game. Success in these power plays, these struggles, depends on the power one has, and that power rests on the amount of capital one possesses. Indeed, capital is the term he used. Bourdieu distinguished various capitals: economic capital, money, property; cultural capital, knowledge, skills, education; social capital, network, relationships; symbolic capital, social status; and linguistic capital, speaking the language of the dominant culture or speaking the accent of the ruling elite. Every field contains structural features or conventions, Bourdieu called them habitus, which are the result of behavior in the past. Consider them as the rules of the game, of the struggle rather, in that field. The point is, the longer you are present in that field, you may even have been born in that field, the better you understand the rules and more likely you are on the side of the winners in the struggle, in the power play. Also, according to Bourdieu, poor people organize their livelihoods in various overlapping social fields. And because success depends on the capitals they possess and their understanding of the rules of the game based on past experience and even birth, they lose the game. Therefore, societal structure tends to reproduce itself because the poor are short of habitus in those social fields that could improve their livelihoods. So both Giddens and Bourdieu argue that human behavior is bounded by structure, but Giddens gives more room and success to agency than Bourdieu. Neoliberalism is an ideology, and an ideology is a set of ideas and beliefs. Neoliberalism is sometimes referred to as Thatcherism or Reaganomics, after the politicians that rigidly pursued it. Neoliberalism prescribes that government policy should strive for creating perfectly competitive markets. Perfect markets are free of government interventions. Perfect markets are supposed to offer equal opportunities to all actors. Creating perfectly competitive markets means favoring policies like privatization, liberalization, and deregulation. Privatization is moving companies from the government to the private sector. Liberalization is the lessening of government regulations and restrictions. Deregulation is the removal of government regulations and restrictions. Neoliberalism entails introducing market types mechanisms even into spaces that operate according to different logics, such as the public sector, NGOs, or universities. Neoliberalism claims that only in perfectly competitive markets, actors can freely organize their behavior according to their needs. In neoliberalism, agency is on top. In the 1990s, neoliberalism became the dominant ideology in development thinking after the dismissal of modernization theory and the dependency and neo-Marxist theories. It was a powerful lobby led by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the US government that was propagating these free market policies. This lobby was called the Washington Consensus. This is Pennsylvania Avenue in New York, in Washington. The World Bank offices on the left, the IMF offices on the right. So the rise of the actor-oriented perspective in development studies largely coincided with the rise and increased popularity of neoliberalism. Actor-oriented research, including livelihood research, was influenced by this ideological context in which it developed. Note that in Lecture 3 I argued that around the year 2000 the livelihood approach was embraced by the Blair administration and did it as part of an attempt to position itself as the third way, searching for the middle road between the neoliberal politics of the preceding conservative administration and the old labor politics of state coercion. Prominent detail, Giddens was in those days the big inspirator of the third way. With hindsight, we have to conclude that New Labour did not fulfill its promise of a third way. The third way turned out just another version of neoliberalism. It is often argued that because of neoliberal contexts in which it emerged, livelihood research until around the year 2010 tended to neglect or ignore power relations. But that is not entirely correct. It depends on how one understands power and power relations. Therefore, I will discuss in the next lecture, and that is lecture 5, two perspectives on power, the residual perspective and the relational perspective. Then I will argue that the emphasis in livelihood research moved from poverty as such to exploitative social relations and their underlying structures, resulting in social conclusion as the root cause of poverty. Meanwhile, you have the opportunity to complete some coursework and to join me in an online class on the Sustainable Livelihood Framework and its context. This short course on livelihood research uses the so-called flipped classroom model. This usually means that students go through lower levels of cognitive learning during their preparation before class starts. This enables students to engage in higher levels of learning in class with fellow students and the lecturer. You YouTube viewers can also take this short course through the flipped classroom. In practice, this means that for each lecture, your coursework consists of 5 successive parts. A video lecture with a PowerPoint of around 15-20 minutes, which can be found on this YouTube channel. So you start your preparations by watching the video whenever you like, whenever it suits you. If you are interested, there is mandatory literature to read. The mandatory literature clarifies issues already discussed in the lecture. To a large extent, you encounter again the issues of the lecture, but the mandatory literature also examines some issues more in depth. If you like, I can also provide optional literature. The optional literature presents additional explanations on relevant issues and offers practical, contemporary, and inspiring examples on how to organize research on particular issues. Of course, you are advised to read the optional literatures attentively, but if you have little time, you should at least glance through it. Or I can send you an assignment. The assignment enables you to apply the subject material discussed in the lecture and the mandatory literature. Finally, after having completed these 4 steps, I offer you the opportunity to participate in an online class, either individually or in small groups. Date and time of online classes will depend on your wishes and what your schedule allows. During that online class, 1 online class per lecture, you will have the opportunity to raise questions for clarification, to formulate critique, and then to engage in applying the subject material by discussing the assignment. It's best to complete steps 1 to 4 before moving on to the next lecture, and it's mandatory for participation in the online class. The reason for that is simple. By completing these 4 steps first, you will have achieved already the lower levels of cognitive learning, and it means that the online class can focus on the higher level of cognitive learning and will therefore be more fruitful and challenging. Start your lecture by looking at the video, by watching the video. On your request per mail, I will make available various resources. That is a document explaining the didactical approach, the mandatory and optional literature, and the assignment. Don't worry, all docs are open access. Date and time of the online class will depend on your wishes on what your schedule allows. So thank you for now. Thank you for your attention. And I hope to see you again in the next lecture, lecture 5, and hopefully also in the online class on the Sustainable Livelihood Framework and its context. Bye-bye.